April 16th, 1945. 8,000 feet above the East China Sea. Ensign Toshio Yoshitake adjusts the white Hachimaki headband tied around his leather flight helmet, feeling the rough cotton against his forehead one final time. Below him, 49 other aircraft maintain loose formation. Mitsubishi, A-6M0s, Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers, even a handful of obsolete Aichi D-3. Aval carrier bombers pulled from training squadrons. This is Kikusui No. 6, the 6th mass kamikaze operation, and Yoshitake has volunteered for what Imperial Navy propaganda calls the body-crashing attack, a sanitized term for what everyone understands means certain death. For months, his commanders have repeated the same equation: one aircraft, one pilot, one life equals one American warship destroyed or crippled. Mathematics, they insist, favors Japan. The divine wind will blow again, just as it destroyed the Mongol invasion fleets in 1281. But in approximately 90 seconds, Yoshitake and nearly all of his comrades will encounter something that renders this entire calculation meaningless. A weapon so devastatingly effective that Japanese intelligence has completely failed to detect its existence. This technology will destroy 48 of 50 attacking aircraft before a single bomb reaches its target, creating what one of the only survivors will later describe as a wall of fire that filled the entire sky. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Toshio Yoshitake was 22 years old when he climbed into his Zero fighter for the last time. Born in 1923 in a farming village outside Hiroshima, he was the second son of a rice farmer, a position that traditionally meant little inheritance and fewer prospects. His father, recognizing the boy's aptitude for mathematics, scraped together enough money to send him to middle school in the city, hoping education might lift him from the endless cycle of planting and harvesting. Yoshitake excelled at geometry and mechanical drawing, dreaming of becoming an engineer. But in 1943, with the war consuming Japan's resources and manpower, 20-year-old Yoshitake received his conscription notice. He chose the Imperial Navy over the Army, reasoning that naval service offered better training and perhaps skills he could use after the war ended. The war Yoshitake entered in 1943 bore little resemblance to the triumphant conflict Japanese propaganda still portrayed. The victories of 1941 and 42 Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Philippines felt distant, almost mythical. By the time Yoshitake completed basic training in early 1944, Japan had lost Guadalcanal, the Aleutians, and most of its experienced naval aviators in the catastrophic Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Imperial Navy that had once dominated the Pacific now struggled to fuel its remaining ships. Training programs that once required 400 hours of flight time before combat assignment had been compressed to less than 200 hours. Some pilots received as little as 100 hours, barely enough to take off, fly in formation, and land without crashing. Yoshitake received 173 hours of flight training between March and December of 1944. This included basic aerobatics, formation flying, navigation, and gunnery practice. He never dropped a live bomb in training. He never fired his guns at a moving target. He never practiced the combat maneuvers that might save his life in a dogfight because, his instructors explained, there would be no dogfights. The strategic situation had changed. Japan could no longer afford to train pilots for conventional combat when American fighters enjoyed overwhelming numerical and technological superiority. A new doctrine had emerged, one that eliminated the need for advanced training. The Special Attack Corps, more commonly known by its propaganda name, the kamikaze. The word kamikaze means divine wind, referencing the typhoons that destroyed Kublai Khan's invasion fleets in 1281. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi formally proposed the tactic in October of 1944, arguing that conventional attacks had become impossible. Japanese aircraft couldn't survive long enough to reach American ships through the wall of defending fighters and anti-aircraft fire. But suicide attacks, Onishi reasoned, required only that the aircraft reach the target. The pilot's survival was irrelevant. This dramatically simplified both training requirements and tactical execution. A pilot needed only enough skill to find the enemy fleet and dive his aircraft into a ship. Everything else, evasion, return, navigation, landing, became unnecessary. The mathematics presented to pilots like Yoshitake were superficially compelling. Japan possessed perhaps 5,000 operational aircraft in early 1945, though this number included training planes, obsolete models, and aircraft lacking adequate fuel or spare parts. The American fleet assembled for the invasion of Okinawa numbered approximately 1,400 ships, battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, transports, supply vessels. If even 1 in 3 kamikaze aircraft scored a hit, Japan could sink or cripple nearly 500 American ships. Such losses would make the invasion untenable, force negotiations, perhaps secure peace terms that preserved the imperial system and avoided occupation. The alternative, defending the home islands against inevitable American invasion, promised only total destruction. Training officers presented these calculations on chalkboards, using precise figures that suggested scientific certainty. They never mentioned that the 1 in 3 hit rate was aspirational rather than demonstrated. They never acknowledged that sinking a ship required far more than hitting it, that American damage control capabilities often saved vessels that Japanese commanders believed destroyed. They never discussed the fundamental problem that if kamikaze attacks worked as advertised, Japan wouldn't need to send wave after wave of pilots to their deaths. The propaganda was mathematically sophisticated and emotionally manipulative, designed to make sacrifice seem both rational and necessary. The psychological preparation was equally systematic. Yoshitake and his fellow pilots attended daily indoctrination sessions emphasizing the nobility of self-sacrifice for the emperor. Officers read aloud from the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, the military code that demanded absolute loyalty unto death. Buddhist chaplains explained concepts of reincarnation and honorable death. Shinto priests conducted purification ceremonies. The message was consistent: dying for the boar. Emperor represented the highest possible achievement, guaranteeing eternal honor for the pilot and his family. Survival, conversely, meant shame, not just personal shame, but shame extending to parents, siblings, and ancestors. The material conditions reinforced this messaging. By early 1945, Japan faced severe shortages of food, fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts. Pilots received reduced rations, perhaps 1,200 calories daily, mostly rice and vegetables, occasionally fish. Yoshitake lost 23 pounds between January and April of 1945, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had been stocky during his farming youth. Fuel allocations meant training flights were increasingly rare. Aircraft sat idle for weeks, while mechanics cannibalized parts from damaged planes to keep a handful operational. Under these conditions, the kamikaze program offered a kind of logic. Since pilots couldn't train adequately, since aircraft couldn't be maintained properly, since fuel was too precious to waste on conventional operations that rarely succeeded, why not use everything once in an attack that required minimal skill and guaranteed the aircraft's complete expenditure? What Yoshitake and his commanders could not know, what Japanese intelligence had completely failed to discover, was that American ships now carried a weapon that fundamentally invalidated every assumption underlying the kamikaze strategy. This weapon was so secret that not a single intact example had fallen into Japanese hands despite 3 years of Pacific combat. It was America's second most protected technology of the war, exceeded in security classification only by the atomic bomb. And unlike radar, which Japanese engineers understood and had partially replicated, this weapon revealed itself only in the instant before death, leaving no survivors to report its existence and no physical evidence for engineers to examine. The proximity fuse officially designated the VT fuse represented one of the most significant weapons innovations of World War II, though it would remain classified long after the war ended. The concept was deceptively simple. Create an artillery shell that detonates automatically when near an aircraft, rather than requiring gunners to time the explosion perfectly. The execution was extraordinarily complex. The fuse needed to contain a miniaturized radio transmitter and receiver, powered by a battery small enough to fit inside a 5-inch shell casing. This entire assembly had to survive the 20,000 G-force acceleration of being fired from a gun, continue functioning while spinning at 500 revolutions per second, detect an aircraft within lethal range using radio waves, and trigger detonation at precisely the right moment. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable in 1940. The British, facing the Luftwaffe's sustained bombing campaign during the Blitz, approached American scientists with a desperate request. Could they create such a fuse? The British had already attempted development, but lacked the industrial capacity to pursue it while fighting for survival. The request went to the National Defense Research Committee, newly formed to mobilize American scientific expertise for war purposes. The committee assembled a team at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland under physicist Merle Tuve, giving them resources and priority that reflected how revolutionary success would be. The technical problems were daunting. Radio tubes available in 1940 were fragile glass devices designed for stationary use in home radios or laboratory equipment. They shattered under even modest acceleration. The team needed tubes that could survive forces equivalent to being hit with a sledgehammer 20,000 times in the fraction of a second, a shell spent accelerating up a gun barrel. The battery had to generate sufficient power from a package no larger than a cigarette pack, activate instantly when fired, and last at least 30 seconds, the maximum flight time for a shell at extreme range. The radio circuitry had to detect the Doppler shift in reflected radio waves caused by approaching an aircraft, distinguish this from background noise and the shell's own rotation, and trigger a detonator with microsecond precision. By 1942, they had succeeded. The final design used specially hardened radio tubes no larger than a thumb, a wet cell battery activated by the G-forces of firing, and a miniaturized radio circuit that transmitted a continuous signal at roughly 180 MHz. When the shell approached within approximately 70 feet of any solid object, the reflected signal created a measurable frequency shift. A vacuum tube amplifier detected this shift and triggered a standard artillery detonator. The entire system fit inside a shell fuse casing 4 inches long and 1 3/4 inches in diameter, replacing the mechanical time fuse normally used in anti-aircraft shells. The implications were staggering. Traditional anti-aircraft fire required gunners to estimate a target's altitude, speed, and heading, set a mechanical fuse to detonate at a calculated time after firing, and hope the aircraft would still be in position when the shell exploded. Human error, target maneuvering, wind drift, and the inherent limitations of mechanical fuses meant that conventional anti-aircraft fire achieved hit rates around 2% under combat conditions. One shell in 50 actually damaged or destroyed its target. The proximity fuse eliminated most of these variables. It didn't matter if calculations were slightly wrong, the shell would detonate whenever it passed near an aircraft, automatically compensating for errors. The effective lethal radius increased from essentially 0, requiring a near-direct hit, to roughly 70 feet. Mathematical models predicted hit rates might increase to 20% or higher, a 10-fold improvement. But the weapon was so revolutionary that its use required extraordinary security precautions. If the enemy captured an intact proximity fuse, they could replicate the technology within months. Worse, they might develop countermeasures, radio jamming, or techniques to trigger premature detonation. The decision was made to restrict proximity fuse use to situations where shells would fall into the ocean, beyond enemy recovery. This meant no use over land, where unexploded shells might be examined. The fuse would be deployed only by naval vessels, only over open water, and only against aerial targets where the shells would inevitably fall into the sea. The first combat use came in January of 1943, when the cruiser USS Helena engaged Japanese aircraft attacking Guadalcanal. Helena's gunners reported immediate success, aircraft exploding after only brief firing bursts, hit rates far exceeding anything previously experienced. Subsequent engagements confirmed the reports. Ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition reported destroying 2 to 3 times as many attacking aircraft as ships using conventional fuses. But the Navy maintained absolute secrecy. Action reports used code words. Spent fuse casings were collected and returned to American ports for analysis. Ship crews were ordered never to discuss the technology. The Japanese remained completely unaware that American ships possessed a weapon that made their own calculations about air attack effectiveness fundamentally wrong. By April of 1945, the proximity fuse had been in combat use for over 2 years, but Japanese intelligence had never identified its existence. This failure reflected both excellent American security and critical Japanese intelligence deficiencies. Japan's espionage networks in America had been completely dismantled after Pearl Harbor. Technical intelligence gathering relied on examining captured equipment and interrogating prisoners, but no intact proximity fuses had been recovered. American forces meticulously destroyed damaged ships and collected spent shells before withdrawing from any position. Japanese observers noted that American anti-aircraft fire seemed unusually effective, but attributed this to superior radar, better fire control computers, and more extensive training. The possibility that Americans had developed a fundamentally new type of fuse never seriously entered Japanese planning calculations. This intelligence failure would prove catastrophic during the Okinawa campaign. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded Task Force 51, the joint expeditionary force responsible for the invasion of Okinawa. His fleet included over 1,400 vessels, the largest amphibious assault force assembled in the Pacific War. The Japanese responded with Kikusui operations, massed kamikaze attacks, designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. The first Kikusui operation, launched on April 6th and 7th of 1945, involved 355 aircraft striking the fleet in coordinated waves. The attacks sank 6 American ships and damaged dozens more. Destroyers on radar picket duty positioned 50 to 75 miles from the main fleet to provide early warning suffered particularly severe losses. USS Bush and USS Colquhoun were both sunk on April 6th. USS Manat Ella Bailey was sunk by a combination of a kamikaze and a rocket-powered Oka-piloted bomb on April 12th. The tactical problem facing American commanders was straightforward but daunting. Combat air patrol fighters could intercept many attacking aircraft, but never all of them, especially when attacks came in massive waves from multiple directions simultaneously. Some kamikazes always penetrate the fighter screen. Ship-based anti-aircraft fire provided the final defense, but kamikazes approached at speeds exceeding 350 knots during their terminal dives, giving gunners minimal engagement time. The traditional doctrine called for opening fire at maximum range, approximately 10 miles for 5-inch guns, and maintaining continuous fire as targets approached, hoping to destroy aircraft before they reached lethal range. The proximity fuse enabled a revolutionary alternative doctrine. Instead of firing at maximum range, ships could hold fire until multiple targets entered a concentrated engagement zone, then create a barrage so dense that nothing could survive passage through it. The mathematics were compelling. A single destroyer mounted 5 5-inch guns, each capable of firing approximately 12 aimed rounds per minute. With proximity fuzzes, each shell created a 70-foot diameter lethal sphere. 5 guns firing for just 30 seconds generated 150 lethal spheres distributed through the engagement zone. When multiple ships coordinated their fire, They could create overlapping kill zones that functioned like a three-dimensional minefield. Any aircraft attempting to pass through would almost certainly encounter a detonation within lethal range. But implementing this doctrine required extraordinary discipline. Holding fire while kamikaze aircraft approached meant allowing them to close within 4 miles less than 1 minute to impact at typical attack speeds. Crews had to trust that the technology would work, that the mathematics were sound, that the barrage would stop aircraft that conventional wisdom said should be engaged at maximum range. The doctrine was counterintuitive, seemingly reckless. It felt wrong to experienced gunners who had trained for years under the maxim that earlier engagement was always better. Yet fleet gunnery officers, analyzing combat reports and running simulations, concluded that concentrated barrage fire using proximity fuses achieved far higher kill rates than distributed firing at longer ranges. The test of this doctrine came on April 16, 1945, when Toshio Yoshitake and 49 other kamikaze pilots approached Radar Picket Station No. 1, 50 miles northwest of Okinawa. 4 American destroyers maintained a station there: USS Purdy, USS Cassine Young, and 2 destroyer escorts. These ships, their crews, and their proximity-fused ammunition were about to validate or refute every calculation about the new defensive doctrine. For Yoshitake, climbing through scattered clouds with his formation, the next few minutes would determine whether his training, his sacrifice, and his belief in the kamikaze strategy's effectiveness meant anything at all. The answer would come in the form of a weapon he couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't survive a technology that would kill him and 47 of his comrades in less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud. The flight from Kanoya Air Base to the target area took 42 minutes. Yoshitake's formation climbed to 8,000 feet, maintaining loose spacing to avoid mid-air collisions, while staying close enough to provide mutual morale support. None of these aircraft carried defensive armament. All machine guns had been removed to save weight for larger bomb loads. Yoshitake's Zero carried a single 250-kilogram bomb mounted on a centerline rack beneath the fuselage. Other aircraft in the formation carried bombs ranging from 250 to 800 kilograms. The largest bombs were mounted on the obsolete Type 99 carrier bombers, slow aircraft that would be easy targets but carried enough explosive to potentially sink a destroyer with a single direct hit. The weather was perfect for their mission: scattered clouds at 4,000 feet, unlimited visibility above, calm seas below. Yoshitake could see forever in every direction, the East China Sea stretching to the horizon in every shade of blue. Under different circumstances, this would have been a beautiful flight. Several pilots had removed their oxygen masks to smoke cigarettes, a final indulgence before death. Others maintained strict discipline, hands steady on controls, eyes scanning for enemy fighters. The formation leader, a 24-year-old lieutenant named Takeshi Kosuge, with 300 hours of flight time, a veteran by 1945 standards, maintained radio silence. American forces could detect radio transmissions and vector fighters to intercept. Silence offered the only hope of reaching the target area undetected. At 1410 hours, Kosuge spotted the distinctive white wakes of American warships on the horizon, bearing 135 degrees. He rocked his wings twice the signal to prepare for attack. Pilots armed their bombs, setting the fuses to detonate on impact. Some whispered final prayers to family members who would never hear them. Others shouted, "Tenno Haika Banzai," long live the Emperor, into the wind rushing past, in their canopies. Yoshitake said nothing, his jaw clenched tight, hands gripping the control stick hard enough that his knuckles showed white through his leather gloves. He had written his final letter to his parents 3 days earlier, carefully composing sentences that expressed gratitude without revealing his fear. The letter sat in a file at Kanoya Air Base, waiting to be delivered with notification of his death. Aboard USS Purdy, radar operators detected the incoming formation at 1408 hours, range 42 miles, bearing 315 degrees. The contact appeared on the SK air search radar as a cluster of blips, too many to count individually, certainly more than 30 aircraft, possibly as many as 60. Radar couldn't distinguish aircraft types or identify whether these were fighters, bombers, or kamikazes, but the bearing and altitude matched Japanese attack patterns observed over the previous 10 days. Lieutenant Commander Frank Verdun, Purdy's commanding an officer, immediately ordered General Quarters battle stations while notifying the other ships on picket duty and requesting combat air patrol fighter support. Within 90 seconds, every member of Purdy's crew had reached their battle station. The 5.5-inch guns, one forward, two amidships, two aft trained skyward, crews loading shells fitted with proximity fuses. The 40mm Bofors quad-mount batteries, 4 mounts with 4 barrels each, swung toward the threat bearing. 20mm Oerlikon cannon operators checked their ammunition drums, each containing 60 rounds of explosive shells. In the Combat Information Center deep in the ship's hull, fire control technicians calculated intercept solutions using data from the Mark 37 gun director, a sophisticated analog computer that integrated radar range data, target bearing and altitude, and the ship's own motion to predict where shells should be aimed. The solution continuously updated as the targets approached, the mechanical calculator clicking and whirring as gears translated geometry into firing angles. 8 F-6F Hellcat fighters from USS Enterprise, already on Combat Air Patrol Station 20 miles northwest of the picket line, received vectors to intercept. The fighters climbed to 12,000 feet and turned toward the incoming formation. At 1412 hours, the Hellcats made visual contact with the Japanese formation at 38 miles from the destroyers. What followed was a brief, violent dogfight at speeds exceeding 300 knots. The Hellcats dove through the Japanese formation, each pilot selecting a target and firing with 50 caliber machine guns. 2 kamikazes exploded immediately, their fuel tanks ruptured by armor-piercing incendiary rounds. A third kamikaze, a Judy dive bomber, took hits in the engine and spun out of control, trailing smoke. The pilot fought the controls but couldn't recover, impacting the ocean 35 miles from the American destroyers. But the Hellcats couldn't stop the entire formation. Kamikaze pilots pressed forward, ignoring the fighters slashing through their ranks. Several Zeros maneuvered aggressively, not to fight but to force the Hellcats to overshoot and break off. The tactic worked. American pilots had to zoom climb to avoid collision, giving the formation precious seconds to continue toward the destroyers. By 1414 hours, 48 kamikazes had broken through the fighter screen and were within 22 miles of Purdy and the other destroyers, closing at 200 knots. The Hellcats pursued, shooting down 2 more stragglers, but the main formation continued unhindered. This was the moment that would test the new defensive doctrine. Aboard Purdy, Lieutenant Commander Verdun watched the radar plot, seeing the cluster of contacts drawing closer. 20 miles, 18 miles, 15 miles. The standard doctrine, the procedure Verdun had, trained under for his entire naval career, called for opening fire at maximum effective range, approximately 10 miles for 5-inch guns, engaging aerial targets. His gunnery officer, Lieutenant Robert Chen, stood ready at the fire control console, finger poised over the firing key. 12 miles. The gun crews could see the approaching aircraft now, dark specks against the blue sky, growing larger with each passing second. 10 miles. Verdun held fire. The new doctrine, distributed in classified bulletins only 2 weeks earlier, called for waiting until targets entered a concentrated engagement zone between 4 and 6 miles. The mathematics promised extraordinary kill rates, but only if ships held their nerve and allowed the enemy to approach close enough that every shell found targets. 9 miles, 8 miles, 7 miles. Chen glanced at Verdun questioningly. Gun captains reported ready, anxious voices crackling over the sound-powered phone circuit. 6 miles. The kamikazes were clearly visible now. Individuals could distinguish aircraft types. 5 miles. Commence firing, Verdun ordered. All batteries, rapid, continuous fire. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Purdy's 5.5-inch guns fired simultaneously, their muzzle blasts creating overlapping shock waves that rattled equipment throughout the ship. The guns operated in automatic mode, reloading and firing as fast as crews could load shells, approximately 12 rounds per minute per gun, 60 rounds per minute total. Each shell traced an arcing trajectory toward the engagement zone, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Flight time to 4 miles at 8,000 feet altitude was approximately 15 seconds. The first salvo of 5 shells reached the formation at 1416 hours and 20 seconds. The proximity fuzzes activated exactly as designed. The lead shell passed within 42 feet of a Zero fighter and detonated automatically, the radio receiver detecting the Doppler shift in reflected signals and triggering the explosive charge. The detonation created a sphere of fragments, approximately 1,500 pieces of steel casing, each moving at supersonic velocity. The fragments shredded the Zero's port wing, severing control cables and puncturing fuel tanks. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell, the pilot dead from fragments that penetrated the thin cockpit armor. Total elapsed time from shell firing to aircraft destruction, 16 seconds. 5 seconds later, 3 more kamikazes exploded almost simultaneously as Purdy's second salvo reached the formation. The gunners weren't aiming at specific aircraft at this range and closing speed. Precision targeting was impossible. Instead, they fired into the mass of approaching aircraft, trusting the proximity fuses to find targets. The strategy worked devastatingly well. Each shell that entered the 70-foot proximity range of any aircraft detonated automatically, hurling fragments in all directions. The dense formation, maintained to provide psychological support for the pilots, became a fatal vulnerability. Aircraft flying in close proximity meant that a single shell explosion often damaged multiple targets. USS Cassin Young and the 2 destroyer escorts opened fire at 1416 hours and 30 seconds, adding their guns to the barrage. Now, 25-inch guns pumped shells into the engagement zone at a combined rate of 240 rounds per minute, 4 shells every second, each creating a 70-foot sphere of lethal fragments. The mathematics became overwhelming. At any given moment, approximately 15 shells were in flight toward the formation. Each second, 4 new shells joined them. Each shell that reached the formation had an extremely high probability of passing within 70 feet of at least one aircraft. The result was a nearly continuous sequence of detonations, creating what observers would later describe as a wall of fire and smoke. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Yoshitake saw the plane ahead of him simply disintegrate. One moment it was there, a Zero with tail number and kill markings visible. The next moment it was an expanding fireball, pieces of wing and fuselage tumbling through the explosion. Then another aircraft to his left exploded without warning. Then 2 more directly ahead. There was no tracer fire marking the shells' paths, no visible projectiles to evade. Aircraft simply exploded randomly throughout the formation, as if struck by invisible hammers. The sky filled with black smoke puffs detonation markers from hundreds of proximity-fused shells. The noise was continuous thunder, overlapping explosions, creating a sound like sustained artillery barrage. Yoshitake pushed his control stick forward, beginning his terminal dive toward the nearest, a destroyer. This was the moment he had trained for, the culmination of his abbreviated life. Around him, other kamikazes initiated their own dives, abandoning formation discipline in desperate attempts to reach targets before death found them. But diving made them easier targets, not harder. The destroyer's fire control systems simply adjusted elevation, keeping the engagement zone directly in the path of the diving aircraft. Shells detonated every 2 to 3 seconds now, each one destroying or crippling another aircraft. At 1417 hours 30 seconds after the barrage began, 28 kamikazes had been destroyed. The survivors pressed their attacks with desperate courage, diving at speeds exceeding 350 knots. But courage couldn't overcome mathematics. The 40mm Bofors batteries joined the fight at 3,000 yards, adding explosive shells to the barrier. Each Bofors mount fired 4 barrels simultaneously at 120 rounds per minute per barrel, 480 explosive shells per minute per mount. Purdy had 4 Bofors mounts. The other destroyers added their own Bofors fire. The combined output created a nearly solid stream of explosive projectiles between 2,000 and 3,000 yards. The 20mm Oerlikon cannon opened fire at 1,500 yards, each gun firing 450 rounds per minute. The Oerlikon fired solid armor-piercing rounds rather than explosive shells, creating visible tracer streams, rivers of green fire reaching up toward the diving kamikazes. The tracers helped gunners adjust aim, walking their fire into targets. But the real killing continued to come from the 5-inch guns with proximity fuses, which maintained continuous fire throughout the engagement. Yoshitake's Zero took fragments through the port wing at 4,000 feet altitude, 2,000 yards from Purdy. The damage was catastrophic. The wing spar cracked, control cables severed, fuel spraying from punctured tanks. Warning lights flashed on his instrument panel, though he barely registered them. His airspeed indicator showed 380 knots, and climbing as gravity accelerated his dive. He fought the control stick, trying to keep the aircraft pointed at the destroyer's superstructure, the aiming point his instructors had emphasized. Hit the base of the superstructure where fires would spread most effectively. 5 seconds to impact. 4 seconds. The proximity-fused shell detonated 23 feet below Yoshitake's aircraft at 1417 hours and 40 seconds. The fragments, approximately 1,400 pieces of hardened steel, traveled upward and outward at velocities exceeding 3,000 feet per second. Multiple fragments struck the Zero's belly, penetrating the thin aluminum skin and ripping through hydraulic lines, fuel lines, and structural members. 3 fragments entered the cockpit through the floor, one striking Yoshitake in the right leg, severing his femoral artery, another hitting his left hip, a third passing through his left shoulder. The pain was instantaneous and overwhelming, a white-hot lance that drove all thought from his mind. His aircraft's nose pitched down violently as the control surfaces, no longer restrained by cables or hydraulic pressure, moved to their maximum deflection angles. The Zero entered an uncontrolled tumble, rotating around multiple axes simultaneously. Yoshitake, bleeding rapidly from 3 major wounds, fought unconsciousness but lost. His vision tunneled, then went black. He was probably dead before his aircraft struck the ocean at 1417 hours and 50 seconds, 300 yards from Purdy's starboard beam. The impact velocity exceeded 400 knots. The Zero disintegrated on contact with the water, the bomb exploding harmlessly, creating a geyser of white spray but causing no damage to any American vessel. By 1417 hours and 45 seconds, 90 seconds after the barrage began, 48 of the 50 kamikazes had been destroyed. Only 2 aircraft had penetrated the defensive fire. 1. A Judy dive bomber so badly damaged that it could barely maintain controlled flight, attempted to crash into Kasin-Young but fell short, impacting the ocean 50 yards from the destroyer's port quarter. The bomb exploded underwater, close enough that fragments peppered Kasin-Young's hull and superstructure, causing minor damage but no casualties. The aircraft's pilot, killed by fragments during his dive, was already dead when the plane hit the water. The second penetrating aircraft, a Zero fighter piloted by Lieutenant Kosuga, the formation leader, managed to evade the worst of the barrage through a combination of violent maneuvering and sheer luck. His aircraft took multiple hits but remained controllable. At 1417 hours and 52 seconds, Kosuge crashed into destroyer escort DE 793, striking the fantail at an oblique angle. The impact killed Kosuge instantly and destroyed the Zero completely. The bomb, already armed, detonated on impact, creating a fireball that engulfed the destroyer escort's aft 40mm mount. 3 sailors died immediately. 12 more suffered severe burns or fragment wounds. But the ship's damage control parties responded with practiced efficiency, controlling fires within 8 minutes and maintaining the ship's operational capability. D-793 remained on station, engines and weapons systems functional. The silence after the barrage ended was profound. Gun crews stood at their positions, ears ringing from 90 seconds of continuous firing, staring at the now empty sky. Smoke from hundreds of detonations drifted across the water, creating a haze that obscured the horizon. The ocean around the destroyers was littered with wreckage shattered, aircraft sections, floating fuel slicks burning with orange flames, life rafts automatically inflating from destroyed aircraft, pieces of airframe too small to identify. In 90 seconds of firing, the 4 destroyers had expended over 2,000 rounds of ammunition and killed 48 enemy aircrew. The engagement ratio was unprecedented in naval warfare. 96% of attacking aircraft were destroyed before reaching weapon release range. Lieutenant Commander Virden ordered a ceasefire at 1418 hours, then immediately directed rescue operations for any survivors. The destroyers carefully maneuvered through the debris field, lookouts scanning for any sign of life. They found none. The violence of proximity-fused explosions, combined with high-speed impacts with the ocean, had killed every Japanese aircrew member. Bodies recovered from the water showed massive trauma, multiple fragment wounds, limbs severed by explosion overpressure, injuries incompatible with survival. Medical officers examined 12 bodies recovered intact enough for identification. All had died within seconds of their aircraft being hit. There were no wounded, no prisoners, no survivors to interrogate about Japanese tactics or capabilities. Purdy's crew conducted a post-action assessment while remaining at battle stations in case additional attacks materialized. The ship had fired 137 proximity-fused 5-inch shells in 90 seconds, over 50 tons of metal hurled skyward at targets 4 miles distant. The guns were so hot that barrel temperatures exceeded design limits. Crews had to spray seawater on the barrels before they could be safely touched. Spent shell casings covered the deck 3 inches deep around each mount, creating a brass carpet that clattered and shifted as the ship rolled in gentle swells. Ammunition handlers had moved shells from the magazines so quickly that several men suffered strained backs and pulled muscles. But the ship had survived without serious damage, and 48 confirmed kills represented success beyond anything the crew had previously experienced. Chief Gunner's mate Robert Harrison, who had served on destroyers since 1942 and participated in over 30 air defense engagements, stood at his station staring at the empty sky. When a war correspondent interviewing crew members 2 weeks later asked for his assessment, Harrison said simply, "We knew the proximity fuse was good, sir, but this was something else entirely. It was like having a brick wall in the sky. They couldn't get through, couldn't evade, couldn't do a damn thing but die. I've been shooting at Japs for 3 years, and I have never seen anything like it. Never." Japanese commanders at Kanoya Air Base initially received reports suggesting the attack had succeeded brilliantly. These reports came from distant observers, aircraft flying reconnaissance missions 20 miles from the engagement area, submarines monitoring radio traffic, radar stations tracking aircraft movements. None of these observers could see the actual engagement with sufficient clarity to assess results accurately. They reported seeing multiple explosions near the American destroyers, smoke rising from the target area, and assumed these indicated successful hits. Standard procedure treated all pilots as having achieved their mission unless contrary evidence emerged. a practice that maintained morale but generated wildly inaccurate battle damage assessments. Commander Motoharu Okamura, who directed kamikaze operations from Kanoya, recorded in his diary that evening, "Kikusui No. 6 appears to have achieved excellent results. Multiple ships reportedly hit at Picket Station 1. Enemy radio traffic suggests significant damage. We have traded 50 aircraft and pilots for perhaps 4 destroyed enemy destroyers. This is acceptable mathematics." But Okamura's assessment rested on faulty intelligence. The multiple explosions, observers reported, were proximity-fused shells destroying kamikazes, not kamikazes hitting targets. The enemy radio traffic, suggesting significant damage, was American forces coordinating rescue operations and ammunition resupply, not damage control procedures. The actual result, 48 aircraft destroyed for 1 destroyer escort lightly damaged, represented a catastrophic failure that Japanese intelligence completely failed to recognize. It took 3 days before reconnaissance flights and intercepted American radio communications revealed the truth. The attack had accomplished almost nothing, and 50 aircraft had been lost. Even then, Japanese commanders struggled to understand what had happened. The loss rate was unprecedented. Previous Kikusui operations had achieved hit rates between 10 and 15%, 1 aircraft in 10 successfully crashing into a target, with perhaps half of those hits causing significant damage. These rates were considered acceptable given Japan's strategic desperation. But 4% effectiveness, 2 hits from 50 aircraft, suggested something fundamental had changed in American defensive capabilities. What had changed, though Japanese intelligence never identified it, was that American crews had mastered the coordinated use of proximity-fused ammunition in barrage fire doctrine. The April 16th engagement was not an isolated success. Between April 16th and June 22, 1945, American forces off Okinawa faced 10 Kikusui operations involving 1,465 kamikaze sorties. The proximity fuse, combined with improved radar-directed fire control and better combat air patrol coordination, achieved an overall kill rate of approximately 75% of all kamikazes before they reached weapon release range. Of the aircraft that did penetrate to attack range, perhaps 1 in 4 scored damaging hits. The overall effectiveness rate for kamikaze attacks had dropped from 15%, achieved in late 1944, to approximately 6% by late spring of 1945. The mathematical implications were devastating for Japan. At 6% effectiveness, destroying or crippling 1 American destroyer required approximately 17 kamikaze sorties. The entire Okinawa campaign involved roughly 2,000 kamikaze sorties total, achieving 34 ships sunk and 368 damaged. But most damaged ships were repaired and returned to service within weeks or months. The strategic impact was minimal. The American fleet continued operations, the invasion of Okinawa proceeded on schedule, and the losses represented acceptable attrition for the United States Navy. Japan had committed its last trained pilots and precious aircraft to a strategy that achieved tactical nuisance at the cost of strategic exhaustion. Japanese commanders recognized that kamikaze effectiveness had declined but couldn't identify why. They attributed the reduced success rates to improved American fighter tactics, better radar coverage, enhanced anti-aircraft training, and superior damage control procedures, all factors that contributed but didn't explain the dramatic change. The possibility that Americans had developed a fundamentally new type of anti-aircraft fuse never entered their calculations because no evidence of such technology existed in Japanese intelligence files. Not a single intact proximity fuse had been recovered. No prisoners mentioned the technology. American crews had been ordered never to discuss it, and most sailors didn't understand how the fuses worked anyway. They just knew the shells worked better. The weapon remained completely invisible to Japanese intelligence despite being in combat use for over 2 years. The human cost of this intelligence failure was staggering. Between October of 1944, when the first organized kamikaze attacks occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and August of 1945, when the war ended. Approximately 3,860 Japanese pilots died in kamikaze operations. They took with them some 7,000 aircraft planes that might have been used for conventional attacks, reconnaissance, or air defense of the home islands against American B-29 bomber raids. In exchange, they sank 47 Allied ships and damaged approximately 300 more. No major warship, no aircraft carrier, battleship, or heavy cruiser was sunk by kamikaze attack during this period, though several sustained damage. The strategy Japan had committed its last resources to, the tactic that consumed its remaining trained aircrew, had achieved tactical results measurable in dozens of ships, while costing thousands of irreplaceable pilots. The proximity fuse accounted for much of this failure, though not all of it. Improved American fighter tactics contributed. Significantly, by mid-1945, combat air patrol procedures had been refined to maximize interception rates. Better radar coverage meant kamikazes were detected at greater ranges, allowing more time for fighters to engage. Enhanced damage control training helped American crews save ships that might have been lost to uncontrolled fires or flooding. But the VT fuse was the weapon that fundamentally changed the mathematical equation. It transformed anti-aircraft guns from weapons requiring impossible precision into weapons that killed reliably whenever shells passed near targets. It made the most desperate tactic in military history, deliberately diving one's aircraft into an enemy ship, into a strategy with a 94% failure rate. After the war ended, when Allied forces occupied Japan and debriefed military commanders, many expressed confusion about what had happened in the final months of the war. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who commanded the 5th Air Fleet, responsible for many kamikaze operations, wrote in his diary on July 15, 1945, "Our losses are unbearable and unexplainable. The fire from enemy ships achieves results that seem impossible given known anti-aircraft capabilities. I do not understand how they shoot down so many of our aircraft with such consistency. Our intelligence services have failed to identify any technological change that would account for this." Ugaki would commit suicide on August 15, 1945, piloting a kamikaze mission hours after the Emperor announced Japan's surrender. He died never learning about the proximity fuse, never understanding that his pilots had been sent against a weapon they couldn't see, couldn't comprehend, and had no capability to defeat. One of the very few survivors of the April 16th attack, a pilot named Hajime Fujii, whose damaged aircraft managed to return to Kyushu with 127 fragment holes and a dead engine, gave testimony in 1947 to American interrogators. His account provides one of the only Japanese perspectives on encountering proximity-phased barrage fire. Fujii described the experience. It was like flying through a storm made entirely of explosions. There was no safe place in the sky, no gap to exploit, no way to evade. One moment you were flying in formation, the next moment everyone around you was dead. Aircraft simply exploded without warning, no visible shells, no tracer fire to show where the danger was. I survived because my aircraft was hit lightly enough that I could still fly, but not so heavily that it exploded immediately. But I should not have survived. None of us should have survived. The mathematics were against us, and we never knew why. The proximity fuse remained classified until after the war ended in August of 1945. Even then, full technical details remained restricted for years. German scientists who examined unexploded American shells in Europe couldn't understand how the fuses functioned. The technology was simply beyond anything Germany had developed, despite German advantages in some electronics fields. Japanese engineers never even got the opportunity to examine one, as Allied forces meticulously recovered or destroyed all unexploded ammunition before withdrawing from any Pacific island. When the technology was finally declassified and publicly described, scientific and military communities recognized it as one of the war's most significant innovations. Historian James Finney Baxter III, in his study of scientific contributions to World War II, wrote that the proximity fuse brought about a revolution in warfare comparable to that wrought by the machine gun. Ralph Baldwin, one of the Johns Hopkins scientists who developed the technology, noted in his memoir that the fuse probably saved more Allied lives than any other single weapon development of the war, with the possible exception of radar. Statistical analysis supported these assessments. Without the proximity fuse, kamikaze hit rates might have remained at 15% or higher throughout the Okinawa campaign. This would have resulted in perhaps 200 Allied ships sunk or seriously damaged, instead of 47 sunk and 368 damaged. Casualties aboard those ships would have multiplied accordingly. The proximity fuse didn't just make defending against kamikazes easier, it made the kamikaze strategy fundamentally untenable. Yet the story contains a profound irony that extends beyond technology, defeating desperation. The Japanese kamikaze strategy was born from a calculation that human life could be traded for material advantage, that determination and willingness to sacrifice could overcome industrial superiority. This calculation rested on an assumption that technological parity existed in weapons capabilities, that Japanese and American anti-aircraft systems were roughly equivalent. The proximity fuse shattered this assumption by creating a technological gap so wide that human courage became strategically irrelevant. Yoshitake's determination to strike his target meant nothing when shells detonated automatically before he came within striking range. His willingness to die meant nothing when the weapon killing him gave him no opportunity to complete his mission first. This is what makes the April 16th engagement historically significant beyond its tactical success. It demonstrated that industrial and scientific advantage, when sufficiently large, can render even ultimate sacrifice militarily futile. Japan had constructed a strategy around the premise that willingness to die constituted an unbeatable advantage, that American unwillingness to accept high casualties could be exploited through tactics, emphasizing Japanese willingness to accept absolute sacrifice. The United States responded not by matching this willingness to sacrifice, but by developing technology that killed those willing to sacrifice before their sacrifice could achieve strategic purpose. The engagement wasn't just a military victory, it was a refutation of the entire philosophical basis of the kamikaze program. The broader implications resonated throughout the final months of the Pacific War. Japanese commanders continued ordering kamikaze attacks because they had no other options remaining, not because they believed the attacks would achieve strategic success. They sent young men to die in aircraft stripped of defensive armament, attacking ships protected by weapons that young men couldn't see, couldn't comprehend, and couldn't survive. The divine wind had not saved Japan. Instead, it had consumed Japan's last military resources, achieving nothing but the deaths of thousands of young men whose courage deserved better than futile sacrifice. In late August of 1945, Yoshitake's parents, living in their farming village outside Hiroshima, received a wooden box said to contain their son's ashes. The ashes were symbolic rather than actual. Yoshitake's body had never been recovered from the ocean off Okinawa, and no remains existed to cremate. The military ceremony that delivered the box included speeches about glorious sacrifice and divine purpose. Officials told his parents that Yoshitake had died successfully attacking an American destroyer, his final act striking a blow against the enemy. This was a lie. Yoshitake had died in an uncontrolled tumble toward the ocean, shot down by a weapon he never saw, his mission incomplete, his sacrifice achieving nothing. Perhaps this final lie was a mercy for his parents. Perhaps it was simply one more deception in a war built on deceptions about invincibility, divine favor, and the supposed mathematics of sacrifice. The proximity fuse remained in service long after World War II ended. It was used extensively in the Korean War, where it proved equally effective against Chinese aircraft. Modified versions were deployed in Vietnam. Modern descendants of the VT fuse now protect naval vessels worldwide, using laser or radar sensors but employing the same basic principle. Automatic detonation at optimal range eliminates the need for impossible precision. The insight that drove the original development that reliable automatic detonation beats precise manual timing has proven universal and enduring. Contemporary anti-missile systems, drone defense platforms, and even some small arms ammunition use proximity detection technology descended from the work done at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in 1940 through 42. The human story, though, remains more troubling than the technological triumph. Yoshitake was 22 years old when he died, educated enough to understand geometry and mechanical drawing, intelligent enough to have become the engineer he dreamed of being. His death achieved nothing strategically, contributed nothing to Japan's defense, saved no Japanese lives, and only delayed inevitable defeat by perhaps 30 seconds the time it took American gunners to shoot down his aircraft. He died believing his sacrifice mattered, believing the mathematics his commanders had taught him, believing that one plane and one life equaled one destroyed warship. All of these beliefs were false, rendered false by a weapon his intelligence services had failed to detect and his commanders didn't know existed. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire story. Yoshitake and the 3,000+ other kamikaze pilots didn't die fighting against known odds. They died fighting against odds that had been made impossible by technology they couldn't detect. They were sent to certain death, not the certain death of suicide tactics, which they accepted, but the certain futility of suicide tactics rendered strategically meaningless by scientific advantage. Their courage was real, their determination was real, their sacrifice was real, but the effectiveness their commanders promised them was fiction, invalidated by physics and mathematics they never knew had changed. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.